Welcome back to the Deep Dive. Today we are taking a long, hard look at a transaction that is, well, it's everywhere, yet it's constantly misunderstood. I'm talking about a financial structure that has become this crucial lifeline for millions of consumers globally, from the electronics store all the way up to the roof over your head. I'm talking about rent-to-own, or RTO.
It's a mechanism that, on the surface, it promises this definitive shortcut to ownership. And it's especially appealing for those who are typically excluded from traditional financing markets.
Right.
But that promise, it definitely comes with a price. And as we're about to find out, the complexity of its structure is really what defines its risk, its cost, and crucially, its legal standing.
Okay, let's unpack this then. We've pulled together a pretty substantial stack of sources examining RTO from every possible angle.
We really have. We're looking at its contentious history, the economics of the high-volume retail side, which is what most people see.
And then the extremely high-stakes real estate sector. Plus, we've even got some very cutting-edge academic modeling that's attempting to formalize and, I guess, sanitize the whole concept using pure mathematics.
The immediate core definition is crucial here because RTO, and you'll also hear it called rental purchase or rent to buy, is essentially a legally documented lease of tangible property.
Yeah.
You make weekly or monthly payments, and the key distinguishing feature, the thing that makes it RTO, is that the lessee has this ironclad guaranteed option to purchase that property at some point during the agreement.
And the property in question, like you said, can be anything. A refrigerator, a car.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Appliances, consumer electronics, motor vehicles, and most controversially, real estate.
So our mission today is to give you a comprehensive understanding of the structure, the history, the controversies, and the ultimate financial impact. The goal is to let you gauge whether RTO truly serves its customers, or if it's fundamentally a high-cost lease that's just masquerading as an easy path to ownership.
And to really appreciate RTO, especially how it's regulated, we have to define it first by what it is not.
Good point.
Because it differs so significantly from two other common forms of consumer acquisition.
So let's start with the one people know best, the traditional lease. If I lease, say, a piece of industrial equipment or a car, I'm just paying for usage for a set term. When that term is up, I return it. End of story.
That's the distinction right there. In a traditional lease, the lessee has no inherent right to purchase the leased asset. RTO is fundamentally different because that purchase option is baked in. It's guaranteed.
Right, whether I decide to buy it in month one or the very end of the payment schedule.
Exactly. And the second distinction, and this is really where most of the legal confusion lies, is separating RTO from the hire purchase or a traditional installment plan.
Okay, this feels important.
It's critical. The defining characteristic of RTO, particularly in the consumer goods space, is the termination clause. The industry calls it the non-obligation clause.
Non-obligation.
In an RTO agreement, the lessee can terminate the entire thing simply by returning the property. That's it. They incur absolutely no further financial obligation, no penalty fees, no debt liability for the rest of the term.
So if you sign a 24-month agreement for a laptop, you're really only ever financially committed for the next week or the next month.
Precisely. Now, contrast that with a hire purchase agreement. That is structured much more like a secured loan. Once you sign, you typically have very limited time, if any, to cancel without being on the hook for the entire balance you've assumed debt.
I see.
RTO legally skirts that debt classification precisely because of that continuous unilateral right of the consumer to terminate the arrangement and walk away, penalty-free.
That right to return the merchandise. That's got to be the industry's most potent legal defense. We're going to see that come up again and again, I bet.
It is the absolute linchpin of their regulatory arguments. And just a quick note on historical context. While we're mainly going to talk about the U.S. retail model, the conceptual use of these transactions started much earlier in the U.K. and continental Europe. It often operated under that hire purchase model we just mentioned, which is a bit more rigid. The U.S. retail sector really started adapting and popularizing its own distinct non-obligation version during the 1950s and 1960s.
All right, so let's start there. Let's get into the place most people actually encounter this concept.
Right.
The high-volume retail world of furniture, electronics, and appliances.
The history here, it really shows this clear path of entrepreneurial adaptation. You had the European precedent, like the UK's Lotus Radio, which was operating as a rental business for expensive electronics way back in 1933.
Wow, 1933.
Yeah, so they sort of paved the conceptual way, but the U.S. pioneers, They recognized that the non-obligation model was the key. That was the secret to unlocking a massive, untapped segment of the market.
And that market being people who need durable goods, a refrigerator, a sofa, a bed, but they lack the immediate cash or the credit score that's required by traditional retailers.
Precisely. Two figures really crystallized the sector in the U.S. First, there was Charles Loudermilk Sr. He started out just renting Army surplus chairs in 1955.
Yeah.
Just chairs. And he later founded the massive chain Aaron Rents. The second was J. Ernest Talley, who launched Mr. T's Rental in Wichita, Kansas back in 1963. And he was instrumental in establishing what is now the giant Rent-A-Center. They are the ones who really formalized the retail RTO structure we recognize today.
And I imagine once the business model took hold and proved just how profitable it could be, they quickly realized they needed to organize.
Oh, absolutely. They needed unity, organization, and standardization across what was a pretty fragmented industry.
So they formed a trade group.
Exactly. The establishment of the Association of Progressive Rental Organizations, or APRO, in 1980 was a huge political and professional step. It began with only about 40 original member companies.
And what were their initial goals, just to set standards?
Well, their goals were to share operational best practices, sure, and develop uniform standards. But also, and this was crucial, to lobby state legislatures to ensure they got favorable regulatory treatment.
Ah, okay. The lobbying arm. And that organization has clearly been incredibly successful in scaling this industry. What's fascinating here is the sheer size they represent now.
It's massive. Today, APRO represents about 350 member companies, and collectively they operate roughly 10,400 stores across all 50 U.S. states, plus Mexico and Canada.
Yeah.
This is an industry serving 4.8 million customers every single year.
4.8 million. And this model isn't just an American thing, it's a global phenomenon. We noted the rapid growth in emerging markets.
Yes, South Africa is a great example. It's noted for its incredibly rapid expansion in this sector. It's projected to reach over $357 million in revenue by 2025, serving an estimated 3.79 million users.
So the appetite for a transaction model that provides immediate access without a credit check, that's pretty much universal.
It seems to be.
That rapid growth, it really demands we dig into the transaction itself.
Yeah.
How does that periodic payment cycle operate, and why is it so flexible?
The consumer goods transaction structure is, well, it's highly transactional. The agreements are based on these really short-term, weekly or monthly rental terms.
And that ultra-short cycle, it constantly re-empowers the consumer, so flexibility is key.
Absolutely. At the end of every single payment interval, the consumer, the lessee, has two fundamental choices that define the whole system. Choice one, renew the lease. You make the next payment, you keep the property for another week or month.
Okay.
Choice two, you terminate the agreement with, and this is the key phrase again, no further obligation by just returning the property.
So the consumer is never, ever tied into a long-term contract. They're essentially renting until they decide to stop or until they've paid enough to actually own it.
That's correct. If they choose to continue payments for a pre-specified period, let's say it's 78 weeks for a stove, they gain outright ownership. The terms are always laid out transparently.
I see.
And what's more, the agreements almost universally include an alternative purchase option. This lets the consumer pay off the remaining balance at any point to gain immediate, permanent ownership.
This all sounds like a pretty great system for immediate access. Which brings us back to the big question. Why are millions of people choosing this pathway, even if it might cost more in the long run? The 2000 Federal Trade Commission survey, the FTC survey, it really pinpointed the main motivators.
Right. That FTC survey gives us a critical look into the consumer mindset. And what you find is that this is fundamentally a solution for market exclusion.
Market exclusion.
The number one reason people cited for using RTO, the lack of a credit check.
That's it. It just sidesteps the biggest barrier.
Completely. Second, the ability to obtain merchandise they otherwise could not get. And third, the convenience and the flexibility of the transaction structure. You know, for a working family whose refrigerator just died, RTO offers an instant replacement without a 3-week approval process for a store credit card.
That convenience, that accessibility, it immediately leads us straight into the core debate, doesn't it? The cost versus value argument.
Here's where it gets really, really contentious. Consumer advocates, and they're often joined by state attorneys general, they consistently express this profound concern that consumers, particularly those with low incomes who can least afford it, are often unaware of the potentially astronomical long-term cost.
Compared to what, though?
compared to traditional purchasing or even an installment plan from a regular furniture store.
We really should make that financial toll explicit. I mean, if a new sofa retails for, say, $800 cash, and the RTO agreement requires 60 weekly payments of $20,
Right.
the total cost for ownership is $1,200. That $400 difference, that's a 50% premium you're paying for that access and flexibility. And if the item is higher priced and the term is longer, the effective APR equivalent it can easily climb into the triple digits.
And that massive financial disparity is what critics always point to. It's cited as proof of a predatory model that specifically targets the financially vulnerable who just have limited alternatives.
But the industry and some academic proponents, they counter that this whole calculation is fundamentally flawed. They argue you can't compare the RTO price to a simple purchase price.
Right, because they say RTO transactions are structured around a non-debt service model.
A service model, what does that mean?
They contend that the higher assessed value and the final price you pay, it factors in several essential bundled services that the RTO provider assumes the cost and risk of. When you buy a sofa with cash, you accept all the subsequent liability.
Sure, if it breaks, it's my problem.
Exactly. When you rent to own, that liability stays with the provider for the entire duration of the agreement.
So what are the concrete services that are supposedly built into that premium?
Well, they include delivery and any necessary assembly, customer support, but most significantly, comprehensive service and repair.
Okay, so if that sofa rips or the appliance breaks down just through normal use,
The RTO provider is obligated to repair it, replace it, or even pause your payments until a working equivalent is provided. The cost of carrying that comprehensive risk and that service provision, they argue, has to be built into the recurring payment.
okay, I hear the industry line defending the premium because the transaction is fundamentally different from a credit sale. But here's the question for me. For a family desperately needing a functional refrigerator, are those bundled services truly worth paying an effective interest rate of 100% or more? Is the consumer primarily buying a service, or is that high cost just a reflection of the risk they pose as a borrower?
That is the essential policy question, and the proponents, they will always circle back to the non-obligation argument. They stress that RTO is fundamentally different because it is not an obligation to purchase.
You can just walk away.
You can terminate the agreement anytime simply by returning the property. If you choose to continue payments long enough to purchase, that's a voluntary conversion of a rental stream into a purchase. It's not a legally binding credit commitment that forces repayment.
This brings us right to the legal battlefield. The legal status and regulation conflict, which defines how the industry is controlled state by state. The entire debate just boils down to one question, doesn't it? Is RTO a lease or is it a credit sale?
That's it. The industry position is firm. It is a lease. Consumer advocacy argues just as firmly that because the intention of the vast majority of consumers is ownership, it should be treated as a credit sale.
And if it were a credit sale, what would that trigger?
Oh, that would change everything. It would trigger comprehensive consumer protection laws, including federal regulations like the Truth in Lending Act, or PILA, and that would demand explicit disclosure of the annual percentage rate, the APR.
Which would be in the triple digits, and that would look pretty bad on the contract.
It would be a major deterrent. Now, at the state legislative level, the industry has historically been very, very successful. As of 2011, 47 U.S. states, plus Guam, Puerto Rico, and D.C., had all passed laws characterizing the transaction as a lease, often with specific RTO legislation written with industry input.
So the legislatures have mostly sided with the industry. What about the courts?
Well, looking at the highest courts that have reviewed this, that's where you see the inherent ambiguity really exposed. Of 5 state Supreme Courts that addressed it directly, 3, Massachusetts, Arkansas, and Maine, concluded that it was indeed a lease. They upheld the legislative determination.
But that means 2 went the other way.
Right. 2 others, New Jersey and Minnesota, concluded that RTO functioned as a credit sale under their specific state credit laws. And that subjected RTO providers to much stricter consumer protection and disclosure requirements in those jurisdictions.
So it just shows how difficult it is to place this structure neatly into one legal box.
It's a true hybrid. And attempts via litigation at the federal level to bring RTO under the definition of credit sale in the Truth in Lending Act, they hadn't succeeded as of 2011. Courts generally acknowledged the complexity, but they hesitated to issue some sweeping redefinition that would overturn decades of state-level rulings.
The most dramatic public case study in these differing opinions, it came from the Department of Defense, the DoD. Yes.
In 2006, the DoD formally labeled RTO a predatory lending practice. They just lumped it right in with payday loans and title loans.
And that carried immense political and ethical weight. To define it as an unfair or abusive loan or credit sale transaction aimed at service members and their families, that's a huge deal.
That was a serious threat to the industry's operations, especially near military bases. But what's so fascinating here is the immediate, swift reversal.
It was incredibly fast. In 2007, the Government Accountability Office, the GAO, publicly raised significant concerns about the methodology and the scope of the DoD's initial research and classification.
So that suggests either massive internal lobbying or maybe a genuine critical reevaluation of the core legal premise.
It was probably a bit of both. Later in 2007, the DoD ultimately reversed course. They concluded that RTO was not a form of credit.
Wow.
Again, they relied on that non-obligation clause. And they formally excluded it from its regulation on predatory lending practices that were aimed at protecting service members. To go from officially labeling a practice predatory to determining it's not credit at all in the span of a single year, that just highlights how powerful that legal distinction, the right to walk away, is in shielding the industry from credit regulation.
It is the entire foundation of their business model. Without that legal distinction, they would be forced to disclose those triple-digit APRs, which would severely restrict their market access.
Okay, one last thing before we leave the retail sector. We need to touch on collection practices. Consumer advocates have frequently alleged that these stores, they routinely push for repossession when a customer is nearing completion.
Right. The idea is they want to reclaim the item and then just start a new rental cycle with someone else. Maximize profit by forcing a forfeiture late in the term.
But the 2000 FTC survey, it found something different, didn't it?
It did. It found a surprisingly low incidence of late-term repossessions.
And the mitigating factor suggested by the FTC for this was the widespread adoption of something called reinstatement rights.
Precisely. In the vast majority of regulated RTO states, the consumer is protected by mandated reinstatement rights. This means that even if your merchandise is repossessed because you missed payments, you retain the right to reinstate the contract, often for several months, just by catching up on those payments.
So you can get your stuff back and pick up where you left off.
Exactly. This ability to recover the item and continue toward ownership, it greatly diminishes the financial incentive for a store to aggressively push for repossession just before the end of the term.
Okay, so we've established that RTO is a complex and controversial structure for a sofa. Now let's pivot to where the financial stakes are exponentially higher. Rent-to-own in real estate. Housing.
This is a specialized and I'd say inherently higher risk agreement. While retail RTO is this continuous everyday business, housing RTO tends to become significantly more prevalent during times of economic volatility and housing market downturns.
Like the years following the 2008 financial crisis.
That's the perfect example.
So why does this mechanism thrive when the broader market is struggling?
Well, downturns often trigger protective regulation. You get things like the Dodd-Frank Act. And while these laws are meant to stabilize the market, they also make it much harder for subprime borrowers or those with weak credit histories to acquire traditional federally backed loans.
So when the gates to conventional mortgages get harder to pass through,
RTO opens up as this vital, if expensive, alternative pathway to homeownership.
So the target audience for this is pretty consistent with the retail side. Tenant buyers with imperfect credit scores who are, for whatever reason, excluded from the traditional banking system.
Exactly. They are drawn to RTO because the lease term, which is typically a negotiated period of 1 to 3 years, it provides them with a critical time window.
A window to do what?
A window to occupy the home immediately while working furiously to repair their credit, save up additional funds, and eventually, hopefully, secure a conventional mortgage. And a really appealing feature is that they can often lock in a fixed sale price at the moment they sign the RTO contract.
Oh, so that shields them from potential market appreciation. If house prices in the neighborhood go up, their price stays the same.
Correct. It gives them a fixed target to aim for.
Okay, let's break down the housing transaction structure because this requires serious upfront capital and commitment. This isn't like renting a TV.
Not at all. The core mechanism is that the tenant lives in the property and makes payments toward purchasing it at that fixed price within the defined period. But the capital commitment starts immediately with the non-refundable deposit.
This deposit, this is a massive point of risk. What are we talking about typically?
It's a significant upfront fee. It often ranges from 3% to 7% of the total purchase price of the home.
So on a $300,000 house, that could be anywhere from $9,000 to $21,000 you have to pay immediately.
Yes. And this deposit is technically called option consideration.
Hmm.
You are paying for the option to purchase later to lock in that price. And critically, it is only credited toward your eventual down payment if you actually exercise the purchase option.
And if the deal falls through for any reason?
That money is forfeit.
Yeah.
It's gone.
Wow. And the monthly payments, they're also inflated beyond the normal market rent for a similar house. That's the rent credit mechanism in action.
Yes. So in addition to the standard market rate monthly rent, an additional premium amount, the rent credit, is paid into an escrow account. So if the market rent is, say, $1,500, your RTO payment might be $1,900, with that extra $400 going into the credit pot.
So it's a forced savings plan, in a way.
It is. That additional above-market payment is designed to help the tenant buyer slowly build up savings for their required down payment.
So let me get this straight. If I fail to purchase the home at the end of the term, I have lost my initial 5-figure deposit, plus all of those accumulated above-market rent credits.
That is the essential risk. That is the mechanism for forfeiture. So we arrive at the decision point at the end of the lease term. The tenant has the right of first refusal to purchase the property at the agreed-upon price. If they've managed to secure the mortgage, great, the deal closes.
And if they can't?
If they can't, or if they just choose not to buy, they walk away and they forfeit both the non-refundable deposit and all of that accumulated rent credit.
That massive potential for forfeiture has to be the #1 source of complaints and legal disputes in real estate RTO.
It is. Tenant buyers frequently complain that they just couldn't secure the loan in time, often because they underestimated the cost of closing or they failed to adequately repair their credit score during that very short 1 to 3 year lease term.
And because these RTO contracts are, you said, inherently flexible, open-source legal documents, there's a lot of room for predatory owners or even organized scammers to take advantage of unprepared tenant buyers.
Oh, absolutely. They can design contracts specifically to maximize the chance of forfeiture.
So what are some of the specific red flags? What are the common contract clauses that lead directly to the tenant losing their entire investment?
A major red flag is the shifting of responsibility for major structural repairs and property taxes.
What do you mean?
Well, in a standard lease, the landlord pays for the new roof or for replacing a broken furnace. In a predatory RTO contract, the tenant may be forced to pay for major capital improvements. You're essentially fixing up the owner's asset with your own money.
And if you can't buy the house in the end?
You've lost not only your deposit and rent credits, but also thousands of dollars you spent improving a property you never owned.
That is a devastating financial blow, forcing the tenant to invest their capital into an asset they're not even guaranteed to acquire.
Another tactic is shifting property taxes and insurance entirely onto the tenant. The monthly payment might look manageable, but then the annual property tax bill for $6,000 or $8,000 comes due, and the tenant is forced to pay it. It creates this massive, often unexpected cash crunch.
And that increases the likelihood of a default.
Exactly. And a default leads to the forfeiture of all accumulated funds. Due diligence in this sector is it's absolutely vital. You need to have a lawyer look at that contract.
Okay, so we've seen the enormous risks that are inherent in traditional RTO, defined by this legal ambiguity and the constant threat of total financial forfeiture. But what if? What if we could move RTO from a flexible, high-risk contract into something mathematically transparent, structured, and auditable?
And that is the exact ambition behind the recent academic research we've uncovered. It's referred to as the NestQuest ROI models. These models are essentially an attempt to mathematically define RTO structures to clarify payment allocation, equity formation, and long-term cost dynamics in a way that is verifiable and transparent to all parties.
This would be a massive step, a huge step toward legitimizing RTO as a mainstream financial tool. The goal is what? To replace human negotiation and vague clauses with explicit formulas and deterministic ledger rules.
That's it, to allow researchers, and maybe one day regulators, to truly evaluate affordability and outcomes under any economic condition.
Okay, let's break down the 3 distinct concepts within this framework. Let's start with the core idea. The NestQuest ROI rent-to-own RTO model. This model, it says it formalizes ownership transfer using something called a tripartite ledger. What does that tripartite structure actually mean for the occupant who's making a monthly payment?
It means that every single periodic payment is meticulously and transparently divided into 3 specific components: consumption, equity accrual, and operating costs.
So it's not just rent anymore.
Exactly. Unlike traditional RTO, where much of the payment is just rent that gets forfeited if you walk away, this model mandates a clear mathematical separation.
Okay, let's ground this in reality again. Let's say the fixed price of a property is $250,000 and the monthly RTO payment is $2,500. How does the ledger split that payment?
The ledger uses predefined algorithms to assign the value. So let's say for this example, $1,500 of your payment covers the pure rental costs. That's the consumption piece.
Right.
Another $400 covers operating costs like property management fees, insurance reserves, and taxes. That leaves $600.
For equity.
Right, $600 for equity accrual. And this $600 is immediately and rigorously used to purchase fractional ownership shares for the occupant.
So the buyer starts accumulating real, recognized equity from the very first payment, regardless of whether they finalize the purchase later on.
Precisely. And, crucially, these fractional shares, they adjust over time based on market-indexed property valuations.
Oh, interesting.
So this means if the house appreciates in value while the occupant is making payments, their equity stake grows proportionally. The model prevents the sponsor, the owner, from unfairly capturing all of the capital gains during the lease term.
That level of algorithmic definition, it takes the guesswork and so much of the legal ambiguity out of the structure. But more importantly, it offers real protection against the total loss of your investment.
Yes, the model includes predefined rules for everything. For revaluation, cost allocation, hardship pauses, and most critically, for exit settlement.
Exit settled.
If the occupant is forced to walk away due to unforeseen circumstances, the model dictates an auditable settlement. It's based on the total accrued equity, which reflects any market gains, minus the costs of their consumption and the operations. This is a massive improvement over the typical 100% forfeiture rule.
Okay, that's the core RTO model. Now, the second model is slightly different, the digital gold savings account. DGSA model. You said this is included because it addresses the other side of the risk equation, the risk to the owner or the sponsor.
Correct. The DGSA is not a rent-to-own mechanism itself. It's best thought of as the inflation-indexed reinvestment layer for the sponsor's funds. Its structure uses a dual ledger system that records account balances in both the local fiat currency and in gold gram units.
So for the sponsor, why is linking their funds to gold price benchmarks necessary in an RTO context? What's the benefit?
The benefit is inflation resistance. Long-term contracts, especially those involving housing, are highly vulnerable to currency depreciation. By linking the account value to independently verified gold price benchmarks, the sponsor's cash flows are protected from losing real value over the years. It provides liquidity while ensuring the stability and inflation resilience of their savings.
Which brings us to the hybrid model, the RTO plus gold model, where these two mathematical concepts merge to create a truly dual-sided solution. This is where it gets really interesting.
This model extends the core RTO design by pairing the occupant's systematic equity accumulation in the real property with a systematic reinvestment process for the sponsor. Both parties are actively building protected assets at the same time.
So the occupant is accruing fractional ownership in the house, protected by that tripartite ledger. But what is the sponsor doing with the money they're getting each month?
The sponsor's cash flows, so that's the recovered principal and the consumption component of the rent, are continuously and automatically converted into gold index savings using that DGSA mechanism.
And this yields what the model calls a dual asset outcome.
Exactly. The occupant acquires the real property, fulfilling their need for homeownership. And at the same time, the sponsor accumulates an inflation-resilient reserve, which fulfills the investor's need for stable, protected returns.
That is a remarkable way to structure risk sharing. It demonstrates that transparency and fairness, they're actually achievable even in these high-cost transactions, but only if the mathematical structure is rigid and transparent enough. This RTO plus gold model, it has been evaluated against some very specific criteria, hasn't it?
It has. It was rigorously tested across multiple criteria, including transparency, reproducibility, auditability, and, of course, inflation resistance. The whole aim is to move RTO from being this financially opaque alternative into a standardized, ethical, and sustainable financial product.
And for anyone listening who wants to really get into the weeds on the math, the research is consolidated in an associated book that fully documents all the formulas, the assumptions, and the computational engine used in these studies.
And it includes detailed simulations comparing the long-term financial pathways of traditional rent, a traditional mortgage, and these new formalized RTO models. It's quite comprehensive.
So we've taken the full deep dive into rent-to-own, from its origins in the UK to the local appliance store, and now to these complex mathematical models aimed at creating fairness in high-risk housing deals.
And I think we can synthesize the dual nature of RTO pretty easily at this point. It offers unparalleled flexibility and accessibility, especially to those with imperfect credit who are locked out of conventional financing. That is its great essential societal strength.
But there's always a but. That benefit introduces significant financial risk and demonstrably higher long-term costs. Whether we are talking about a television or a house, the premium you pay covers the risk of service provision and the provider accepting that non-obligation clause.
The right to walk away.
The fact that the consumer has the right to walk away. And that cost is invariably passed on to that same consumer.
And particularly in the real estate sector, because traditional RTO contracts are open source and often lack transparency, there's just continuous room for bad actors to take advantage of unprepared tenant buyers. This can potentially lead to the forfeiture of major deposits and rent credits, sometimes after the tenant has already invested their own capital in repairs.
So it's a transaction mechanism that is, at its core, driven by the failure of the mainstream system to serve everyone. And it often requires the most financially challenged among us to pay the highest premium for necessary access.
Which leads us to the final provocative thought we want to leave you with, and it really concerns the future of this mechanism. Given the development of these highly formalized and mathematically transparent structures, like the NestQuest ROI models we just discussed, will RTO finally transition from a niche, high-risk alternative into a mainstream, regulated, and inflation-resilient pathway to homeownership for credit-challenged consumers?
Or will the fundamental challenge of RPO, the necessity of bundling those extensive services like repair and maintenance, and the fact that the buyer has the unilateral option to walk away, will that always keep its cost structure significantly higher than traditional financing, making it a viable option only for those who truly have no other choice?
The ultimate answer may hinge entirely on whether regulatory bodies accept and maybe even mandate the kind of transparency offered by these new models, forcing that cost disparity to be justifiable by genuine service provision, rather than just hidden risk.
Something to mull over until our next deep dive. Thanks for joining us.
Until next time.